Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Cruz.
This is Bryce Vine.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is Sebastian Junger.
This is Daryl.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summit.
This is Dr. Bob Greenberg.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
I'm Lou Bazcewski, and I'm the author of Louch and the director and producer of a film called Path of the Past. And I'm excited to be on the Break It Down show.
And now, the Break It Down show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
Terrific. Lou Bazcewski is indeed an author and a filmmaker, and his documentary film, which is based on his book, is called Path of the Past. It's the story of his grandfather, and man, it's a wonderful tale that you tell in such a personal way that it drags you in, and if you are any number of things. First of all, if you are of Polish heritage, if you know anybody who fought in the European theater in World War II, if you are a military history buff, there's so many reasons to appreciate this film, man, and it was just compelling and beautiful and a wonderful tribute that was told with reverence and respect, and we love it. Lou, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Will you tell us the story of the story as it unfolded to you and as you were called to take the mantle of telling it?
Well, that is probably the most interesting story because my grandfather, like so many others of his generation, was very modest, humble. He didn't think of himself as anything but somebody that did their job, and he would often just say, "Oh, I was just a tanker." And little did we know how much he had actually gone through. And it was, I was just out of school. I went to school for history and writing. And I had published some other projects in relation to oral history and current events, history within the 20th century. So I started talking to my grandfather more about just really growing up and things, because I had no idea. And none of us knew the scope of what he had seen. And it was at a point I think he just became more and more comfortable, and it really just kind of exploded out of him all of this really rich experience that he had never, I think, shared with anybody besides some of his good friends from Pocahontas that he grew up with and other veterans like himself. And I think he really just wanted to get it down for the sake of those people that were around him that never made it. And that personal guilt of survival and that feeling of reverence, he really gave to me in a way that I really, the whole film was to try to reflect that understanding that I had, because I had such a close relationship with him, and I felt it needed to be shared with other people, because every veterans event I do, every time I do something, always somebody comes up and says, my dad would never talk, or my uncle would never talk, or some family member, even in the present conflicts, Vietnam, going back, Korea, you name it, they've always been tight-lipped about it, and so I felt it was necessary to share it with other people.
Well, I appreciate that you did that. And in telling this story, you did a number of things. You told the story of the 1st Army, 3rd Armored Division. You told the story of all of the folks who went in Sherman tanks, how badly we were out-weaponed. And then you told the story in a beautiful countryside that has, since transformed. But you told it with enough photos of the carnage that had happened before, and so you couldn't escape the raw experience that your grandfather did so well to hide from your father's generation. And then in terms of capturing his outpouring, you were there to catch it all, and you had the experience and the training to get it and to retell it in a way that we could all be drawn into it. Did your path, your educational path, have anything to do with the fact that you wanted to get this story? Or were you close enough with your grandfather that you thought he might give it to you? Or was that just a happy coincidence, or he saw you coming?
It really was organic. When I studied history, I studied mostly contemporary American studies and labor and a variety of other topics in history. But my emphasis was not military whatsoever. It was oral history and primary documents and those kind of things. But it just fell into place that all of those things allowed me to tell his story very well, because he not only had his first-hand account, but I was also able to find another fellow who served with him named Les Underwood, who was a gunner in his tank. And then additionally at University of Illinois, it really was an opportunity I couldn't pass up. It was within right where I went to school. They had this huge archive of the 3rd Armored Division. They actually had his after-action reports, all the different documentation that had been donated to the university over the years was because it was, I cannot remember the colonel's name, but it was his alma mater. So he just happened to donate all this stuff, and I was able to get access because I went to school in Illinois. And so it really was a variety of different amazing things that happened to not only get the book together, but then the trip itself. There were just numerous occasions where I didn't set anything up, and I hope it's clear in the film that all of these meetings and stuff I never set it up beforehand. It was strictly organic, and a lot of times it made your hair stand on end, because I'd felt like really there was something else at hand because of the people that I met that had these amazing stories to corroborate my grandfather's story or expand on it. It was just remarkable. It's hard to describe.
Yeah, so for the audience, you rode a bike a lot of the time through these different little hamlets on the European countryside as you followed basically your grandpa's path. Like their tank drove across this town and you went to try to find the bridge, and you would share the picture of the current day and the old day. But the other thing is I was noticing the timing. Like, when did you actually do the production? Was it in 16 or when was it?
It was in 15 that we did principal filming in Europe. Yeah. And it was just myself and a cinematographer. I mean, it's pretty, low budget operation. And, we were,
the timing to me is incredible too, because you have these people that were old enough to remember, their experience with the Battle of the Bulge or this massacre that the Germans did, or, just these different events, like the guy with the miracle parents. That guy may today be dead. I don't know, but he's a critical piece in the movie because he has these living memories of what happened. It's just incredible that you were able to capture this really just in the nick of time.
Well, and that fellow, and he is actually a well-known Belgian historian, and he lived just down the road from a museum there in L'Église, and that was like the furthest penetration of the 1st SS Panzer Division. And I went to go see a tank there and just, talked to a museum person there that didn't know much about really what happened there, and I asked if there was anybody locally that could speak to us, and she said, well, Gerard Gregory lives down the road. And I said, well, I've read things that man wrote. He literally lives right here. And she said, yeah, he lives just down the street. So we walked out, and if you see in the film, he's sanding his fence to put a new coat of paint on his fence. He just happened to be standing outside, and I had a translator that day who was from the Mons Museum, which was also a town they fought through, and she introduced me, said I was a grandson of a 3rd Armored Division tanker and a 3rd Armored Division historian, and he immediately said, let's do an interview. So we sat down in his kitchen and did that, but we did not have that set up at all. It just happened.
Yeah. Yeah, that's just such an incredible, fortunate circumstance. And then he pulls out the same illustration. Now, your grandfather's path to victory, or whatever that picture is called. He had the same thing. Are those all hand drawn, or what are those? Are those lithographs, or what were they?
Yes, they were. Well, there was a main one drawn for the division, but then a fellow named he was a chief warrant officer, A.J. Palfy, did add some detail on to make it specific to the Lovelady Task Force, and it shows all 5 major campaigns of what they went through, but everybody in the 3rd Armored Division went through the same map. He just added some different details to that specific one. So there were only so many of those maps. So even within the 3rd Armored Division, there were even less of the Task Force Lovelady maps versus just a main 3rd Armored Division map. So it was just miraculous. And he had been like a pen pal with Colonel Lovelady, who was my grandfather's commander, task force commander, for a great part of the war. And what the map shows is basically where 152 of them in his company, D Company, landed on D-Day plus 17. But yet by the end of the war, there were only he and 17 other men that survived that trek. And the great majority of that 152, the great majority of that 152, they died. They were killed in action, because a tanker, they would either be obliterated or burned, and it wasn't a less of a chance of getting wounded rather than just perish. And the Sherman being outgunned in such a variety of ways, it was literally a death trap. And there's some other historians that have kind of claimed over time that it was a great tank in the sense of mechanical reliability, and that's only true if you really just kind of neglect all the facts about how many people were killed, and just neglect to even care about how many crew people died. And as Americans, we've always, I think, prided ourselves in the idea that we're going to try to get as many of our people to survive. And so if we keep that in mind, then the Sherman was a mistake and always is a mistake.
Yeah, like I can say a Toyota Camry is a perfect car. I never need another car. But if I want a pickup truck, it's not that. And if I want to go fast, it's not that. It's not a lot of things. And the Sherman tank is, it's mechanically reliable. We could make a load of them, so we could if it took 10 Shermans to kill one German tank, we were going to win the war. But it didn't take quite that many. But you're right. As a combat veteran, the last place I'd want to be is in a tank on a front line, because those things get, you build weapons to destroy tanks. It's the most terrifying thing if you see it coming, and it's terrifying to be inside of it. It's
the fate that they faced, and then seeing their others around them and what happened to them, I just can't imagine how difficult that was to get back in that thing every day. Knowing full well, and my grandfather says it in the film, there were times where they saw an 88 millimeter or even a 76 millimeter tank gun go through one side of a Sherman and out the other. Really in every possible way, in the sense of armor, the height of the tank, it was a larger target. In the sense of speed, mobility, traction, it was an abysmal failure. Were it not for the Soviets, we would have never had a chance to really land it. The U.S. never faced a fully equipped Panzer division on the Western Front.
Thank God.
Right, and that it was literally 5-1 or more. They were the only time that they would engage a heavier tank was if they absolutely had to, and it was under ambush. In most cases, the only time they prevailed was really due to air support or other means. But they had a tank destroyer, had a 90 millimeter on it, but there was kind of a weird plan with that, and they kept the tank destroyers in one unit. They didn't split them up into the platoons of Shermans, which my grandfather felt was always a really ridiculous mistake. But they didn't have anything that could penetrate. There was an occasion, which is discussed in a movie, and they knew they had a 76 instead of like the more common 75 millimeter, and they knew they were hitting this Panther tank again and again, and by chance the crew had abandoned it later on, and they were able to actually walk up and look at the tank, and they said there were 19 ricochets off the front of that tank.
Wow.
Wow. You know, I don't want to give away everything that's in the movie because there's a lot for our listeners to go and see. And again, for our listeners, our guest today is Lou Bazcewski. His film is called Path of the Past, and it's about his grandfather's trek from one end of Europe to the other in the only Sherman tank that made it all the way. So, you know, Pete and I are famous for speaking in superlatives, and he says that, well, we'd just send 10 Sherman tanks over there, but I caught the statistic in the movie, and I heard you say it just now that the number wasn't really 10, but it was genuinely 5. That it was 5 to 1 that we would send tanks over there, and we knew that we could outproduce them. I want our listeners to get all of that from the book, from the movie, and you guys, it's great stuff. You're going to enjoy it, so please go out and give it a watch, because you'll for one thing, you're going to wish Lou's grandpa was your grandpa, or you're going to see your grandpa and Lou's grandpa. You know, there was a reason that they called that generation of Americans the greatest generation, and it was a lot to do with the fact that they endured all they did as young as they were. They came back here, they led quiet lives, they got back to work, raising families, and kept quiet and kept all of the experience that they had seen, all the horrors of war, bottled up. We just got lucky that your grandpa found a grandson who was a storyteller. Both naturally and by training, and who was willing and eager to soak all this story up. Now, I want to talk about your preparation for making the film, because, you know, like you said, a lot of this storytelling stuff and a lot of what you gathered was organic, and that you got lucky a lot of times while you were over there and running into people who would point out a landmark you never would have found, or talk about you know, things that had happened there and things that were destroyed that you never would have known about. And they were generous with pictures and stories. What did you do to prepare to go over there? Because all that stuff being spontaneous is great, but clearly you went over there with an open mind and an open heart, and people were willing to, you know, let you have it when you asked about what had gone on there. What prep did you do? Like, what you went over there with camping gear and a bike, it looked like.
We had a rental car. The cinematographer, you know, was hauling all the gear in the car, and we would kind of meet between places and, you know, hook up different equipment. But yeah, it was jam crammed in that vehicle, and the preparation for getting all that was, you know, predominantly getting all the gear together, for me to research as much as possible a clear path that I could understand, and that we could try to follow as closely as possible. But in combat, what I found a lot, and was very interesting, a lot of the towns are misspelled, or different locations would be a bit off from their maps and so forth. But you can totally understand and respect that in the process of their writing these after action reports after they plowed through these destroyed towns, and it was very difficult to even know what was what. But all the preparation that I did for it, in the sense of research and the documents that I went through, and his division history and his own stories, really paled in comparison to seeing the places myself, and then actually interacting with people that had photographs and other details, because the War Department suppressed a great deal of these photos. You know, and hindsight 2020, it's for a valid reason, but it also, to this day, I don't think Americans have the understanding of the scope of destruction that was there. And there was nothing for me to prepare for that. Like, I thought I had a good understanding based on all the books and all the stuff. And I'm actually the division historian for the 3rd Armored Division. I have done my homework, but it did not prepare me when I went over there to see the photos and the tales from the Europeans themselves on the level of destruction that was there.
That's amazing.
It was so pervasive. Every town that they went through was absolutely destroyed in a way that we just can't comprehend. And I think that's a double-edged sword. I mean, it keeps us insulated from what occurred, but it also, I think, allows us to be a little more gun-ho about going into conflict and things that we should maybe step back and think and listen to people like my grandfather or Les Underwood and see what they think about it. Because they knew what they had to do, what had to be done, but at the same time, they wouldn't encourage anybody to ever do it unless it was absolutely necessary.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about the resolve of these guys because they did win. And, your grandpa in the story talks about Sergeant Katie. And I love, look, every era has its own little PC flavor. But I love the directness of people who've done hard shit, like get shot at and everything else. And so we had Lynn Vincent on, who wrote the most recent book about the USS Indianapolis that gets sunk in the same war in the the Pacific campaign. Mm-hmm. And these guys were dying. Their friends are being eaten by sharks. And when the Navy finally shows up, they don't know who this is. They're all covered in oil. They don't know if they're the enemy or what. And so the legitimate question the officer asks as they pull up to these guys is, who are you guys? And then, after all this misery, after all this pain and death, some salty Navy sailor goes, typical officer asking dumb questions. That's his first thing he says. And people literally are dying by the second. Like, as they're rescuing him, 2 more people die as they're being rescued. They don't make it. And that's the first thing this guy has to say. And Sergeant Joe Cady reminds me of that because, you tell that story when they get to the crossroads and he's like, nah, I think there's a tank up there, and they're the lead tank. And, in typical officer fashion, and look, officers got to do what they got to do. Like, why is the column stopped? We need to go forward. Let's press ahead. And, old Joe's up there going, there's a tank up there, I think. Let's check it out. And he's like, no, let's push ahead. He's like, well, I'll hop up here in this tank and
ride into it with us.
Yeah. I love that story.
Yeah, that is a great story.
And what's that officer do? He's like, drive on. I'll see you later. I'm going back to where I was.
Right. We'll wait for the infantry to make a report. Was what right? Because that was the whole holdup. But I grew up hearing those stories about Joe Cady, and I don't think there could be any more of a hero in my life for my grandfather to have him as a hero and know that he saved their lives just numerous times, and it was because he would stand up when there was a bad command or a bad decision, and that really troubled my grandfather throughout his life that he didn't make it. But it's undoubtedly because of him that my family exists. Yeah, it's a hard one to swallow, and it never was something that my grandfather could accept. But he was really something else. He was a good enough commander that even there were times, and it's in the book, not in the film, that he stood up to officers in some of the most provocative ways, and was still just pulled aside by their Captain Stallings, who was also a tank commander, so he knew exactly what it was like. And he would say, hey, you shouldn't have talked to that colonel that way, or you shouldn't have talked to so-and-so that way. And he would always just kind of get a slap on the wrist because they knew he was so good at his job.
Right.
But his Captain Stallings, was burned when his tank was hit in Normandy. and actually they were hit by a flamethrower, and he narrowly survived. Had to pretend to be dead, and lost the majority of his crew, and then crawled back through enemy lines at night. And so he knew all too well how outgunned that Sherman. He eventually became company commander, so it was like he had a really good buddy at the reins that would back him up when he stood up to officers who didn't know what the heck was going on. But again, the officers, and they had some exceptional officers, just like Captain Stallings, Colonel Royston, General Rose, the commander of the division itself.
I don't want to, like John said, I don't want to spoil the movie for folks, but I do love some of the things the insights that, look, as a guy that goes outside the wire, there's just ground truth reality, and there's moments in war where there isn't conflict at that moment. And there might be in 10 seconds, you don't know, but you do have to, you have human curiosity, there's jokes, there's all kinds of things that happen. But I love the story about your grandpa getting out and going and checking out the tank that they just had tore up, the one I think that you said had 18 ricochets off of it. Those kind of stories. How much of that stuff doesn't make it into the movie, or maybe is in the book instead? But how much stuff's on the cutting room floor where you're like, man, this is a great tale, and it really illustrates, because what that story does, and you may or may not realize this, is it just shows the humanity of these guys. Yes, they're in this grinding fight. Yes, their friends are dying. It's hard. They're hungry. There's no time for pain, but there's also these moments where everything stops and you get to be just a curious 21-year-old dude.
Well, one that I really wish we would have fit in the film, and there's discussion of it in the book, obviously, was there was a point in Normandy, and they were confined to the roads, those hedgerows, kept them confined, so they were an obvious target. And the lead tank was always just a matter of time, and they just lucked out, time after time when they would rotate who was lead tank. But on one particular day, there was a sergeant that he was there. He was the lead tank, and that was Sergeant Martin of D Company, and their driver. He had post-traumatic stress, or what he called it, combat fatigue at the time. Same thing, and he broke down. And he said his driver started crying, and it stalled the whole column. Well, the colonel, it went all the way up to Colonel Royston, who was commanding at the time, and the colonel said, I don't care what you have, get going, get out of the way, you got the whole column stopped up. And that Sergeant Martin told in the radio straight to Colonel Royston, he said, I've got a driver that's gone bad, and he goes, I don't give a damn if you were Eisenhower himself, I'm not going to move without a driver. And Colonel Royston, who was an adept commander and had the utmost respect of all his men, just said, go around him. And he was never written up or anything. They understood, because Royston himself commanded a tank, and there's some discussion of him in the film a bit, which I would have loved to have more about him, Captain Stallings, Sergeant Martin, like that comment. But he literally said to that colonel, I don't give a goddamn if you were Eisenhower himself, I'm not moving this tank. And that was one of my grandfather's favorite stories, he said, because they never did anything to him. He said they never got written up or anything because they understood.
Yeah, sometimes the reality of war kind of I don't know what else to say, but outgunned or outranked rank itself. And there are a lot of stories in the film that, like Pete said, capture the humanity of the experience, because all these guys were kids for the most part, right, who made all these sacrifices. They were kids, and at some point, the battle fatigue or the stress, the PTS, is going to kick in for anybody. The perseverance and just how goddamn uncomfortable they were for such long periods of time. You told it in a fascinating way that wasn't. I don't know, man. I got caught up in the way the film was written. Clearly, as a filmmaker, you are first and foremost a writer and a storyteller, and I appreciate that about the way you made this movie.
Well, thank you for that. I really
when you look back at the film and you think about the way that you told the story, what has evolved since since you did principal photography... Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero, co-host of the Break It Down Show and fellow producer here at Lions Rock Productions. And I'm proud to announce our newest show. It's called Justice. Season 1 is going to be a deep dive into some of the cases I personally worked on as a licensed private investigator, and you'll get a unique view into the criminal justice system that may just challenge some of your personal notions about how it should work and open your eyes in ways you never imagined. So keep your ears open for Justice, a brand new podcast from Lions Rock Productions to iTunes, Stitcher, and wherever you get your favorite podcasts. What has evolved since? Since you did principal photography a couple of years ago, what has evolved in your mind about how you've told this story and what's a little different, and have current times and the suppression of information that you found out existed, has what's going on nowadays in the landscape of news and events colored your thinking about how and why they suppressed information back then?
That's a great question. I honestly feel that everyone feels, or the majority of people think World War II is this ancient kind of, distant thing, and it really was not that long ago. And it was, as my colleague that's in the film, Todd DiPastino, exceptional historian, said, World War II was the largest singular event in human history. And I think because we have suppressed information from that, I think it's given Americans a very jaded, kind of distant understanding of conflict and the cost of conflict. A great story to illustrate that. When I was a kid, I used to play war. I knew my grandfather was in, the war, and I was always, dressing up camo and stuff like that and playing in the yard. And we were playing with my cousins and stuff in the backyard. And he pulled me aside at one point, and he said, you know what would happen if war came to your town? And I said, Grandpa, I don't understand. He said, you're going to have to take everything you own, and leave it. You're just going to have to load up what possessions you can carry that you need just to survive and load them on a cart or what you can, because there's going to be no gas. And it was just things you never think of that he had seen, because he had seen the monstrous stream of refugees and all the people that were just pushed around by that war. And he just wanted me and the rest of my family to understand what war meant. And the whole effort with the book and the film has been to do that, not to glamorize it, not to kind of bolster this sense of American exceptionalism that I think has really hurt us in the long run. And my grandfather was not a fan of a lot of our foreign policy. He was very much against a lot of our actions. So to me, it is so relevant. Whereas, the average person just think, well, that happened a long time ago. What does that mean? And living with somebody that saw that and saw our modern times, and every day would look at the paper. He literally every day would read the paper, and he would, when we talked, he would say, man, I think about these men and women today that are serving. And he said, he was so troubled by how they had to be deployed 4, 5, 6 times. He said, I literally said, I only had to do one hitch. He said, but these men and women keep having to go back again and again, and I don't think that's right. And people aren't looking at the fact that we have a volunteer force that is really getting driven into the ground, that 20 or 22 a day figure, depending on which statistics you read. Military Times says it's closer to 20. That's something that should be in the news all the damn time, and it really troubles me that it's not in the discussion. And I have a lot of friends that I myself didn't serve. I feel like my service is to try to tell these stories, to get it out there. I have a lot of friends that served in the process of this, and to them, it's just as relevant as it is to me.
Yeah, I think the most important thing, and you know, again, I enjoyed the film a lot, but even more than my enjoyment of the film, I think it was important to watch. And the most important thing about it was the personalization of the experience, because it wasn't that long ago. You know, we're human beings living in modern times. Everything that your grandfather went through are all things that we, you know, all go through in our coming of age, and all of the things that he wanted, we all want. The difference is the sacrifice that he had to make at a time in his life where most of us didn't have to make that particular type of sacrifice. And all of the guys around him, you know, the sacrifices that they all made. And you're right, it's glossed over to the point where I think a lot of even our generation, and I think our generation has seeked it out. But, you know, my kids, you know, it's not a fault of theirs that it's completely lost on them. And the history that is taught about World War II is, a lot of it is the broad strokes and the glossed over stuff and the American exceptionalism, and we don't understand that as much sacrifice as we made as a country, it's not close to the sacrifices of the countries that were in Eastern Europe who had to fight. Right. You know, and the destruction and you know, all of the things that you talk about in a way that allow us to not just revere the destruction, but to really understand that, man, these were human beings. They all wanted to do the same things we want to do. Right. And they were forced into this situation. And, you know, it's a reflection, I think, on their experience that was so personal that's what made, you know, I don't mean to beat this point into the ground, but again, I enjoyed the film. But even better than that, I found it was important. I found it was important to, you know, to take the education that the movie brought. My grandfather was young during World War II, and so didn't fight as a serviceman. But I'm from Guam, and Guam was occupied the duration of World War II until the Marines came and liberated it. But the occupation experience was a different experience than the European theater. And so that's what I heard growing up. And when I exposed myself in the beginning to, you know, what it was like in Europe, a lot of it was the stuff that you see in war movies, the glamorizations, you know, we went over there and kicked ass. And, you know, a lot of what was lost was what it really meant to have to go over there. So, you know, again, I'm going to encourage our listeners to watch the movie. It's called Path of the Past. It's a brilliant film. Our guest today is Lou Bazcewski. He's a filmmaker and an author, and there is also a book, so you should also read the book. And tell us again the title of the book, Lou.
It's called Louch, and that was my grandfather's nickname because my great-grandparents were Polish immigrants, and they spoke only broken English. And so my great-grandmother used to call from my grandpa out the door of their house and said, you know, Luchik. And so the neighborhood kids who ended up actually all serving around him in the First Army, which was amazing. He had multiple friends, a fellow named Mel Weber, a guy named John Hastava, another buddy named Dave Pagan, and all four of those fellows, and Stanley Cravens as well, all five of them ended up in the U.S. First Army. And they ended up, you know, making strange connections in some cases throughout. But they were the ones that called him Louch, and that kind of stuck with him his whole life. So
that's a good nickname. The other thing is, we're gonna, when we put the show on the website, we'll put a link to we'll put an Amazon link up so that our listeners can buy the book as well. Because it sounds like as much as we love the movie, there was more stuff in the book.
Oh, much more. And
as is always the case.
And the film is more about these kind of, like, amazing things that I found in addition to what's in the story. But there's just so much more about his miraculous survival. He was in every major land campaign in the European theater of operations. So you're talking about Normandy, northern France, the Ardennes campaign.
Battle of the Bulge, Market Garden. Let me help you out.
Right.
So, and when you want to read all of the Medal of Honor citations, Lou's grandpa is probably standing 45 feet away. I mean, because he's in the middle of all of it. Like, it gets lost a little bit on how incredible it is to go from the beach at Normandy to, stopping early because the Russians want to take Berlin and everything. But he went to the very end. As far as they went, he was there. And all of the impossible fights. Look, here's a quick story, and this is not an unknown story, but at the Battle of the Bulge, the Americans were so surrounded that the Germans sent a guy, white flag, like, let's parlay real quick. Hey, let's discuss your terms of surrenders, Americans. And the general sends back one word: nuts. I'll be goddamned if I'm going to be goddamned. Get the fuck out of here, Lou's right there. Lou's grandpa's right there. Louch is in tank, freezing his ass off, There's a guy from the 82nd who the 3rd Armor fought directly with, and he's like, ain't nobody going past me. And to this day, the 82nd doesn't wear jackets outside because that guy laid in the snow and said, fuck you, you're not going to get past me. Louch was right there with those guys. The craziest airdrop you could ever imagine for the Battle of the Bulge. Basically, what helps them turn the tide are the Dirty Dozen, the actual guys. We had on Jerome Preisler, who wrote about these guys, and it was all those guys could do all the military could do to stop those guys from flying through clouds and jumping in an impossible jump. There just miraculously was a little clearing in weather, and these guys were able to drop enough supplies in to help turn the tide. Louch was right there with those guys. Like, that's how hard all this stuff was. So his survival is not just uncanny or weird. It's impossible. There were so many people. Yeah, impossible.
Yeah, pick a storied battle in the European theater in World War II. And like you said, he was 45 feet away at most.
Right. Freezing his ass off, hungry, in the same shitty tank. Hey, what happened to that tank, Lou?
His tank that, they had the same tank all the way in through Germany, and then they were that tank was taken away from them actually when the bulge occurred. So where that actually ended up, I do not know. Unfortunately,
that'd be a hell of a find there, right?
Yeah, I think whoever took that tank was probably being procedural and had no idea.
Right.
That
no
was
one's
the
got
sole
time
survivor.
for that. Let's just go get these Germans.
That was a real hard shot for that crew, and it was to my knowledge what my grandfather thought was Colonel Lovelady wanted to organize all the 76 millimeters into one platoon, and they fought him on it, argued with him, but he insisted, so he was the colonel. So.
Yeah, well, I mean, ultimately the mission has to come first, like nostalgia and luck and all that stuff. That's sort of secondary, right? Like, we got to, when tanks are getting torn apart every day, sometimes you got to reorganize stuff and evolve to the fight. I get all of that.
It may have been the right decision by him, hard to say,
Yeah. Well, hey, look, your grandpa survived, so,
Exactly.
You don't want to roll the dice again. And
There were no wrong decisions in that regard.
So let me ask you, so you're not a guy who makes documentaries for a living. You start with this idea, and then I always say every movie's an impossible dream, but you've actually got a movie, and maybe you're going to make some editing changes, but you've got the bulk of the work is done. As you're sitting down trying to figure out, what the heck am I going to do? How do I fill these gaps? What do I do with all these other? Like, how did you put all of that stuff? Timeline, I get that. Normandy all the way to the end. I get that part, but how do you figure out how to tell the story? I mean, you said good things were left on the cutting room floor, but how did you sort through it all? It's impossible to sit there and at the beginning, knowing what you know now at the end, to do this.
Well, some of the stuff was hard to swallow that we had to cut, and I mean, the original cut was closer to two full hours, but it was necessary to condense it to make it a better story, and I was able to step away from it. And so even though I'm obviously very emotionally tied to this story, it made sense to really cut it down just for the everyday person to get like a good sense of it. And we're probably going to cut a little bit more down to the standard 90-minute. But I think it'll leave an opportunity to do other things and kind of extra scenes and that. So the main point was for me was to tell that timeline as best as I could, get some of the more powerful stories in there, and then especially to try to reflect that these people were still human beings and they had to come back and they were still people. And I think there's some contemporary movies that have shown tankers having not so much in the sense of scruples and willingness to just shoot down people, and that really isn't true. And any tankers that I've talked to or worked with really just reject that whole notion. It make them look like merciless killers. And I think the main thing was I wanted to show that these were still human beings at the end of this, and they kept their humanity, and they were better than that. And I think that's what all, the everyday American service person, man or woman, wants people to know, that they have to do horrible things, but their goal is to keep their humanity in spite of it, and they did that. But that's what I hope I reflected in that process. And you gotta make some hard changes and hard swallows. I had some really great stories in there about Joe Cady, his tank commander, and being able to meet his family and some other things. We just had to really cut it down.
What's something that happened that just absolutely shocked you with like the serendipity of that moment? Was it on the trail in Europe? Was it at like some kind of phone call that someone out of the blue calls you? What was that thing where you're like, I never in a million years would have guessed this would be the outcome? The probably the most profound one was the lady that I met in Parfandry, which my grandfather drove up into that and really witnessed the aftermath of a massacre there in that town. And to a degree, I'm not giving a lot away from the movie here because these are kind of the background details of it. But we interviewed the woman in town, and it was just because I had a translator that day, and we were talking to people at this tourist place in the town of Stevolo, which is right nearby Parfandry, and a woman there said, I know this other woman, and it so happens her mother survived that attack in Parfandry, and she owns a hair salon in town. And so we walked down to the hair salon and had a conversation with her. She immediately called her mother on the phone. Her mother gets on the phone and says, I'd love to meet you. So at a later date, we set it up, had an opportunity to meet her. She came out, and as it turns out, when my grandfather came into the town, they just saw corpses. It was, it was a hellish thing. I mean, they killed men, women, and children. And in the nights that followed, it was Christmas Eve, and on Christmas Eve they were surrounded by the 1st SS, actually Hitler's own division there. And that's one part of the Battle of the Bulge that really isn't reflected in some of the stuff about Bastogne, because really some of the heaviest and best equipped outfits were further north where my grandfather was, and the hold at Bastogne really cut them off from supplies. But the main thrust and the bulk of equipment and soldiers was really in the north, pushing towards the Meuse River, and they hit that main thrust in and around Stevolo. Well, when they knew they were out of gas, they just started just killing civilians and soldiers alike. These were the same people that committed the Malmedy massacre, which people are familiar with. But somehow this girl, who was 3, I believe at the time, she had run, and the only reason that she
made it was because they missed her. She was lower to the ground, and they shot her mother and brother right next to her. And she ran to a farm where her father was hiding. Now, a lot of this we couldn't even fit in the film. But when she did, she was hiding on that farm, and as my grandfather was, they counterattacked, and they surrounded them on Christmas Eve, and all their infantry were killed, and they had no one to alert them. So they were in their tanks, surrounded on Christmas Eve. They thought, we're going to die tonight. And my grandfather said they were praying and hoping. It was snow was coming in. It started in the 22nd, 23rd. Really started snowing heavily. Some say it got up to like 18 inches deep. You know, they thought we're done. So they strung grenades in a perimeter around where they were staying, and all of a sudden, late at night, something set off those grenades, and they thought, here they come. You know, here comes Hitler's own division, and we're going to die on Christmas Eve. And it turned out it was cows. A group of cows hit those grenades and started setting off those lines. Well, they laughed and, you know, kind of celebrated. But that woman, 72 years later, I guess it was, she heard those cows blow up in the night. And so when I am explaining, I don't think we could get the depth of it into the film because it was too much to explain. But that woman,
it comes through, but it took some thinking to figure that out. But yes, the same cows. That's crazy.
Right. Those were those cows. And they were, while my grandfather was excited and you know, thanking, you know, the powers that be that it was just cows and not the SS, you know, this was a little girl frightened to death on this farm with her dad, who had just lost her brother and mother to the SS, you know, hours before. So the chances that I would be in this town is just microscopic. Most everybody was killed in the town, so the chance that I would meet her 70 years later is just beyond belief.
Yeah, that is really one of the important things that, again, ties together the humanity. I'm, you know, as much as I enjoyed it, as much as I've already said, the film was even more important than it was enjoyable. It's even more so now that I understand your intention in the movie. Not that your intention didn't come through, but just to hear it from the horse's mouth, that you really wanted to kind of bring the story home for everybody and make it personal account that everybody could attach to in this way, and to understand what everybody had gone through, I think, you know, makes it for me even more powerful.
I want to go through one last thing here as we wrap up the hour, because your grandpa's story is incredible, and we haven't even got to the part where the humanity is most grinding and horrible. But when they go and they liberate that concentration camp, you know, first off, from all of humanity, thank you to your grandpa for, you know, for doing that. It's incredible. Makes me emotional. And I just, to know what that's like. I mean, I personally have seen video of recent kids dying in Bosnia where people killed kids from their own neighborhood to pin it on another group. And that's how grisly war can be. And I would say that's horrible, but nothing compared to busting open the gates on a concentration camp and going in and looking at that human atrocity. Like, there's just nothing worse than that. Tell me a little bit about what your grandpa's, you know, was he still emotional 70 years later? I mean, give us an idea of what that left with him.
Without a doubt. I mean, it was one of the toughest things for him to talk about. Apart from Pafandri, where they found those civilians killed, those were probably the two toughest situations where they found men and women, children killed, and then when he was in what they called Nordhausen. See, the U.S. intelligence suppressed a lot of that. Nordhausen was the nearby city, and they actually liberated a barracks there where they were keeping all the dead and dying people that were either too weak or refusing to work inside of the factory that was nearby. What it was the camp was really actually what they call Mittelbau Dora or Dora, and it was a factory that was creating V1 and V2 missiles, mostly V2s, and it was the first example of a ballistic missile. And the irony is, the thousands of people that it killed with the missiles. I think it's somewhere in excess of 6,000 or 7,000 people that in mostly around Antwerp and London, where they launched the missiles to. There were more people killed in the facility making the damn things than were killed by the actual missiles or rockets. And it was a hellish environment. It wasn't even an operation fully making the missiles for it was less than a year, but over 26,000 people died there. And what he saw in that camp, and it was just, I can't comprehend what was said and talked about there. If I had this outlined on something. I could read something to you that is actually from the 3rd Armored Division that I think explains it as well as anybody possibly could, if you might like to hear it.
Yeah, please.
Although the taking of Nordhausen did not constitute the heaviest fighting of April 11th, that city will live forever in the memories of the 3rd Armored Soldiers as a place of horror. The Americans couldn't believe their eyes. No written word can properly convey the atmosphere of such a charnel house. The unbearable stench of death and decomposing bodies. The sight of live human beings starved to pallid skeletons, lying cheek by cheek, jowl by jowl of 10-day dead. Hundreds of corpses lay over the acres of the big compound. More than hundreds filled the great barracks. They lay in contorted heaps, half-stripped, mouths gaping into dirt and straw, or they were piled naked like cordwood in the corners and under the stairways. Everywhere among the dead were the living, emaciated, ragged shapes whose fever-bright eyes waited passively for the release of death. Over all the area clung the terrible odor of decomposition, and like a dirge of forlorn hope, the combined cries of these unfortunates rose and fell in weak undulations. It was a fabric of moans and whimpers, of delirium and outright madness. Here and there a single shape tottered about, walking slowly, like a man dreaming. There was no hope for many of the prisoners in this place.